Chapter 2. Complete Surrender. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. John 6, 5-10. "Get our stools, Hannon," Emmett said, as he nodded toward the dough on the baker's bench. "I'd like to rest my legs for a moment while we wait for the leaven to do its work." Then he added, "I'll tell you the story while we wait for that loaf in the oven to bake." Hannon rushed over and grabbed a pair of stools, delighted he had found a way to make Grandpa take a short break. "Our family have been bakers for generations," Emmett said. Hannon mouthed the words along with his grandfather. Grandpa Emmett started most of his stories with that phrase. "But you've never seen so many people enjoying fresh, warm bread all at once," Hannon interrupted. "Who's telling the story, son?" "You are, Grandpa," Hannon said, as he grabbed a hunk of the previous day's bread from the bench to occupy himself. "But yes, you're right. We'd never seen that much beautiful bread, and haven't since, for that matter." Emmett playfully raised a thick silver eyebrow as he glanced at Hannon. "But we're not to that part of the story yet, young man." Resting his hands on his knees, Emmett began again. "Our family have been bakers for generations. Just as my father was sent out daily with a basket of fresh bread to sell to our community when he was a boy, I was sent out to sell bread in the same way." Hannon piped up, still with a mouth full of bread. "And now that's our job, right, Grandpa?" Hannon was referring to himself and his younger siblings, although since Hannon was now an older teen, he spent most of his time in the bakery, learning to make bread. "That's right, my boy, and you're all terrific at sales, and you're getting pretty good at baking, I might add." Then, with a wink, he said, "But don't talk with your mouth full." Hannon blushed, as Emmett continued, "One day my father packed a small basket of bread and directed me to walk out to where a crowd had gathered outside our village." As an aside, he added, "Of course my mother threw in a couple of dried fish to tide me over until dinner. She always thought I'd starve if I went more than an hour without a snack." A smile formed on his kind, wrinkled face as he recalled the scene. More people than I'd ever seen had gathered to hear Jesus, the rabbi, teach. With a sentimental tone, he mused, "I guess my parents figured I could sell my basket of bread in record time." "But sales weren't that great, right?" "Correct. People were so fixed on Jesus' words that most of them ignored me as I walked through the crowd." Setting the basket back on the workbench, he added with a wink, "I suppose I wasn't as handsome as you, with that thick, wavy hair of yours." "Naturally." Rolling his dark green eyes, Emmett continued, "I wasn't sure what to do with myself, so I went and sat down next to Uncle Andrew, a family friend." "Andrew was one of Jesus' disciples, right?" Hannon asked. He knew the answer, but he loved hearing Emmett recall every detail. "Yep, he was one of the 12, Emmett replied. "I still remember how relieved Andrew looked as I approached him. When I sat down, he put his finger to his lips, pointed to where Jesus was talking with Philip, and whispered to me, 'I think you're just in time, Emmett.'" "Philip was a disciple too, right?" "That's right," Emmett confirmed. "So I looked toward Jesus and Philip, and even though I couldn't hear what Jesus was saying, I do recall what Philip said." Hannon quickly swallowed another bite of day-old bread, and mimicking Philip's deep voice, said, But, Lord, it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Are you going to take all the good lines in this story, Hannon? Emmett teased. Hannon bit off another hunk of bread and pointed at his mouth, as if to say, I can't talk, my mouth is full. Grandpa Emmett shook his head and continued, Before I knew it, Uncle Andrew stood, lifted me to my feet, and brought me to Jesus, saying, Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. Then Andrew winked at me as he asked, But how far will they go among so many? Hannon's dark brown eyes grew wide as he imagined the scene again. Jesus smiled at us, Emmett continued. I think he was proud of Andrew for catching on to the plan. Then Jesus quietly said to the 12, Have the people sit down. At this, Emmett got down on one knee, looked directly at Hannon, and continued the story. As the disciples began to organize the crowd, Jesus got down on one knee in front of me, your grandpa, and said, Could I have your bread, young man? Hannon was so caught up in his grandpa's story that he actually offered the day-old bread he'd been snacking on to Emmett. Emmett chuckled as he accepted Hannon's offering. I don't actually want your bread, Hannon. I was just letting you know what Jesus said to me that day. Oh, yeah, of course, Hannon said nonchalantly, with a forced laugh. I knew that, Grandpa. Emmett stood and tousled Hannon's hair. However, Emmett continued, you just did exactly what I did all those years ago. I held out my basket of fish and loaves to Jesus. I mean, what else can you do when Jesus asks you for something? Hannon nodded with understanding, as Emmett added, As I surrendered my basket, Jesus accepted it, gave thanks, and then proceeded to give everyone as much bread as they wanted. Hannon slowly shook his head, and tried, once again, to process the miraculous story of Jesus using his own family's bread to feed thousands. How did he do it, Grandpa? Without a word, Emmett walked over to the brick oven in the corner of the bakery. Using a long-handled wooden bread peel, he removed the unleavened loaf, walked back over to Hannon, and asked, How about a piece of fresh bread? Thanks, Grandpa. Hannon tore off a piece of the warm flatbread, almost too hot to touch, releasing its fragrance and steam into the crisp morning air. He held it up to his nose, breathing in deeply before taking a bite. It was wonderful, slightly crisp on the outside, but warm and moist on the inside. Emmett sat, put his hands on his knees, and attempted to answer. How did he do it, you ask? How did Jesus feed thousands of people with my tiny basket of bread? He gave a deep sigh. This is just what Jesus does, Hannon. He takes whatever we surrender to him, makes it holy, and multiplies it. Hannon closed his eyes as Emmett spoke. Was the bread warm, Grandpa? He asked. Warm and perfect, son, Emmett replied, closing his eyes as the aroma of the bread brought back every detail of the old memory. You see, Hannon, he said, looking directly at him. His eyes had a way of piercing right through a person. Jesus has a way of transforming our meager offering into something amazing, while using it to bless people around us. He did it with the bread. He did it with the disciples. And he'll do it with your life, if you let him. Hannon stared down at the bread as he processed his grandpa's words. Yet, as amazing as that bread story is, Emmett said, as he tore off a piece of the fresh bread for himself. And believe me, I could probably talk about it all day. It's actually not my favourite bread story. Emmett paused, closed his eyes, and slowly savoured the piece of bread. Hannon's eyes flashed up at his granddad in surprise. It's not, he asked, moving to the edge of his seat in suspense. Not even close, Emmett said. Motioning with his head toward the workbench, he continued, But before I tell you that story, you need to tend to that dough. It looks like the yeast has just about finished its work. With an exasperated, "Okay," Hannon reluctantly stood and returned to his work at the bench, feeling more eager than ever to hear another bread story, his grandpa's favourite.